Thank you for being here today. Let me start thanking Lucinda and Higot for the very nice hospitality in Lisbon, and also Peter Skolten, that being part of ReSOMA consortium, as well as the leader of CrossMigration and the coordinator of IMISCOE, allowed ReSOMA to build fruitful synergies at several levels. And eventually I thank also the ReSOMA team, which during the last 2 years worked incredibly hard in implementation of a quite ambitious proposal winner of an H2020 funding. So, started in February 2018, the research social platform on migration and asylum is now turning to its end. So both CrossMigration and ReSOMA were conceived as a unique complementary effort, bringing migration knowledge to policymakers. CrossMigration with the systematization of knowledge, of academic knowledge, while ReSOMA mostly enhancing the ongoing dialogue between experts with distinct professional backgrounds. Here you can see our consortium. There is a university, some think tank in Brussels, and the most important partners we had are the social platforms, bringing together the representative of all the NGOs working in Europe on migrants from different perspectives. ReSOMA primarily aims at supporting a sustainable and mutually beneficial collaboration between EU researchers and stakeholder networks in the area of migration, asylum, and integration. Second, it's making EU's platform for policy dialogue and consultation more evidence-based. We had a workshop before with this evidence-based approach was problematized a little. Third, raising the new evidence-based top priorities for the EU policy agenda. But more broadly, ReSOMA is intended to enhance this active dialogue between academics and scholars, policymakers, and representatives of the civil society stakeholders. So we brought together this three community of people that are experts on the same fields. And in this regard, ReSOMA is what has been defined as a research policy dialogue. More precisely, a research social policy dialogue. In ReSOMA, the structure of this research social policy dialogue takes the shape of a deinstitutionalized dialogue, which is typical of highly politicized debates as nowadays those on migration are. And among migration issues, when the politicization degree was lower, the research policy dialogue were more institutionalized and stable, meaning that there were a group of experts, ad hoc commission. I'm sure that this has been an object of studies of several people here. And nowadays, given the great increasing of this politicization level of migration issues, we are assisting a progressively destitutionalization of relationship between knowledge and policies. And this implies that dialogues becomes more open, informal, flexible, and mostly more focused. In fact, ReSOMA defined 18 topics, 9 per year, 6 per each area of asylum, migration, and integration. In this way, the ReSOMA debates occurred on topics identified according to their relevance in current policy debate, considering both the existing priorities in the European policy agenda and the emerging needs that were not prioritized yet. This was the topics from year 1, and then the topics for year 2. This way, ReSOMA had a possibility to bring evidence from civil society stakeholders, mainly, and also from the academia to the policymakers. And it happened, for instance, regarding the criminalization of NGOs supporting migrants, where on the one hand, the project had an unexpected and quite surprising media coverage, and on the other hand, it was possible to open an ad ad hoc dialogue between NGOs and DG Home Affairs with the Irregular Migration Unit. And we consider that a success because considering that we are doing this exercise in a 2 years time frame, having this kind of connection and the possibility to feed into an ongoing debate that was quite hot, it was something for us. And so thanks to IMISCO, we can also see a kind of future of what we've been done over the last 2 years. In the next 3 years, we now have the possibility, starting from now, that the ReSOMA steering group meetings, members will keep on meeting, identifying these top priorities, topics that will present on a ReSOMA webpage on the new IMISCO web infrastructure. And we already had these topics for the 2020. That is, these are a proposal. So we have now an open consultation if this could be really the top priorities for the 2020. And in addition, the networking activities started within the ReSOMA platform will continue, bringing among IMISCO scholars, civil society, stakeholders, significant members. So in the next IMISCO conference, we will have also the possibility of having workshops, not only among scholars, but with civil society. And so a special thanks to IMISCO and the External Affairs Committee that allowed us to achieve this important goal. But being the chair of this panel session, I'm not supposed to talk any further on the project, so it is indeed better to listen to our dear guests that today are here, a living example of what ReSOMA has been through the last 24 months. A debate among experts with distinct professional backgrounds, reciprocally challenging themselves between knowledge and reflexivity. So I would start with Laurent Aujean. Laurent is a policy officer in the unit Legal Migration and Integration in DG Migration and Home Affairs of the European Commission. He is working on labor market integration of third country nationals and on studies and statistics on integration and legal migration. He studied economics and political science at the Free University of Brussels. So, Laurent, in which areas have you seen that research conducted through a multi-stakeholder approach has been influential within DG Home?
Many thanks for this question and for inviting us. It's true that for us starting to take into account research, it's really about interacting, being aware of the various projects being ongoing. It's a very first step. And indeed, last week I was in this dialogue with a number of Horizon 2020 projects on migration and various policy units in the Commission, and I felt that it's very important to have this more often, because otherwise both worlds really live and are working apart from each other. I think ReSOMA and CrossMigration, in my view, are two very good examples of projects that manage to let's say, to have these closer interactions between what academics produce and what academics know, what policymakers try to resolve, and also a lot of organizations in between, so including, let's say, civil society organizations. Now, we have this big paradox in migration research and policy making, is that there have never been so much knowledge produced. When I say knowledge, perhaps going beyond academic research, also thinking about data, about the number of papers produced by think tanks. So the number of recommendations we also receive every week. And perhaps at the same time, so little use made of all of that. There are many reasons for that, and I think it's important to recognize and analyze them. But just to mention that indeed, at the Commission level, we create this knowledge center for migration and demography. There's been huge investment into better data, into a data hub, data catalog, harmonizing more EU statistics on migration, asylum, and Horizon 2020 has indeed invested millions of euro into new calls for projects. So where is the problem? I think it relies into it relates to the issue of time. Clearly, as you know very much, there is disconnection between the timing of research and the timing of policy making, and we can also take the blame over the last year to always having been acting in urgency. So if you go back to 2016, where we proposed new proposals on asylum, well, the directives already being in place were not even fully implemented. We're already proposing new ones under the urgency, so even without impact assessment. So if you see that there is not even an impact assessment, how can we expect that we have really looked at all the existing research existing in the academic world on a certain topic? So, I'm lucky working in the field of integration and legal migration, where we have been working with a bit of less pressure in a way, and it's a luxury then to have more time to invest into research, to invest into data, to invest into a dialogue with various stakeholders. And I must say that also beyond the academic world, there are also those intermediate actors, think tanks, our internal research capacity, whereby, for instance, the Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography it can produce for us, let's say, state-of-the-art and basic statistical analysis on a certain key policy question in a few months' time. So for us, it's also a kind of luxury. It doesn't mean they can reply to any policy questions we have, but clearly the issue of time is one which is important. The issue also of topics, areas. It's true that a lot of emphasis by many policy units in DG Home over the last few years has been on how to curb irregular migration. Well, it's not the priority for many academics. It is for some of them, but so there is also disconnection in terms of priorities, in terms of what are the key research areas, to the key policy questions to be solved. Also, often academics wonder what is happening or what has happened, while policymakers tend to blindly focus on what should we do, and not even, bother starting to understand, things that are more profound questions about transformation, social transformation, etc. So, do we need to change this? This is also a question, because last week we have a debate also whether academics want to produce things that are relevant for policymakers or not, and perhaps it depends what you mean by relevant. But clearly, when you're in the remit of Horizon 2020 or Horizon Europe project, the aim is still to be useful for decision making. It doesn't mean that academics have to align to perhaps the very narrow questions that exist currently. But clearly, we hope that in the future we can have more of these interactions between the two sides. I'm not sure there are two sides, but let's say, if we put it in a simplistic way, I would argue for more interactions, more awareness on both sides of the priorities, the logic, and what is in the pipeline. As you know, there is also some turnover inside policy units in institutions, well, at EU as national or local level, and that sometimes when a research project takes 4 years to produce first results, well, it means that those who launch the results may not be there anymore. So it's as simple as that. in a sense, create this constant dialogue, constant awareness, constant interactions, sometimes come up with intermediate results to make sure that we are aware that we can exchange on changing priorities, on interim results, and also perhaps to come up with some state-of-the-art summary. And I think on both of these examples, to understand the logic of policymakers and create state-of-the-art summary, both CrossMigration and ReSOMA are really excellent examples of where we can better build on existing knowledge. It doesn't mean that, that academics have to start working only on the research questions imposed by policymakers, but really building on what practitioners know, what academics work on or have worked on. I would argue that the 100,000 articles we find in CrossMigration would deserve to be well digested, and I think it's very key in the future if we can invest into supporting academics to summarize some of them in 10 or 20 key policy questions that not summarize all those articles. What I mean is that if you select 10 or 20 key policy questions that decision makers have in mind to really have a kind of ideas, not only on what works, because this rely a lot about robust evaluation of some policy program, and they don't always exist, but at least what do we know about, key research questions. I can perhaps give some examples later on in the discussion. And then don't hesitate to talk more to the media also. It was discussed yesterday. I mean, it's not often that we hear academics on migration having 20 or 30 minutes on the radio to explain well, what we know on the topic. And I found it quite surprising that we talk so much about migration without much evidence. And if you see sometimes in the debate, it goes to very simple thing. And I see that sometimes, obviously, demographers or other sociologists, other scientific people on migration, they have to a bit put the level down to very basic things that the public doesn't know necessarily, and it may not be nice for you to not be in the more complex and let's say elaborated policy or academic discussion, but sometimes we really feel that we also lack the link to the media, to the wider media. And then just perhaps to finish, don't hesitate to hammer to us the simple message you have, in the sense that over the last few years, we saw clearly that some of the findings, some of the messages, some of the link, for instance, between development and migration, or about the link between borders and people staying or not, circular migration, some of the link between environmental change and displacement, some of the key findings you had, I think, got through the policy debate inside the Commission, for instance. Now, it's not to say that your role is only to influence EU decision makers. I think it's also very important to talk to local, regional, and national decision makers, because these are also those making decisions and making the debate. But just to say that don't hesitate also to come back again and again with those simple messages you find from the literature and that may be obvious to you, but perhaps not enough in the policy debate on migration. So many thanks.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Indeed, you touched upon some crucial points we experience in ReSOMA, the time constraint of being quick and given the evidence at the right person in the right time in order to be used, then the need of more interaction, the relationship with the media, and of course, some simple messages. This is important because, of course, you cannot go deep into the thousands of articles that are already there. So, yes, the effort should be to bring you the evidence you need. But I think that Andrew can give you an answer at this regard. Andrew Geddes, no need for presenting him, but by the way, he's Professor of Migration Studies and Director of Migration Policy Center at the European Universities Institute in Fiesole. And between 2014 and 2019, he held an ERC Advanced Investigator Grant on the drivers of migration governance in Europe, North America, South America, and Southeast Asia. So please, Andrew, how can the research social policy dialogue support the good governance of migration and asylum?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's, I think also just to explain at the start, EUI was part of the CrossMigration project, and EUI has had a long association with IMISCO, so it's great to see CrossMigration, ReSOMA becoming institutionalized within the IMISCO network, and certainly EUI will be strongly committed to maintaining these important developments. So it's very, really, it's great to be here, also quite daunting because speaking on this kind of topic to a room full of experts is it's quite a daunting experience. You'll have your own experiences. So what I was going to do was kind of make one point and tell a story. And the point I wanted to make is that, and from my own experience, the issue is not so much the migration research that we do. Obviously, that's important. That's why we're here. But I think one of the key things is actually how decisions are made, how people absorb data and evidence, how people's understanding of data and evidence is influenced by the cognitive biases that we all hold. So, and through the research I did in the ERC project that was just mentioned, that was what we were particularly interested in. We saw governance as a process which was fundamentally shaped by cognitive biases, but we all hold cognitive biases. So I think that's actually a rather fundamental question as we talk about, the relationship between research and good governance is what, superficially you could call the real world of decision making, but the way in which we are all shaped by biases that affect how we understand, receive, absorb information, and also how we interact with other people about that information, because knowledge is always formed and developed in a social context. And so at the EUI, we're in a privileged position in many ways, literally where we're located in Fiesole, we're in a privileged position, but metaphorically also because we get to participate in many of these great processes like this conference or through interaction with a variety of organisations. So we become, in a way, players in this process as well, mobilising our bias, but also interacting with others, which maybe also encourages you to think about your own bias. So the story I wanted to tell you is about our work on public attitudes to migration. Everybody's interested in public attitudes to migration now, for obvious reasons. We're interested in public attitudes to migration. So we've created what we call our Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, where we try and bring together data. And today we're going to bring together a resource. It will be launched, not deliberately today, but by coincidence today, a resource that tries to look at the findings across the literature to understand a bit more about how the scientific literature understands attitudes to migration. But So the basic challenge in this story was to understand a little bit more about attitudes to migration because they have a big effect on policy and good governance. The reference here is to the public. And the reason, and the point is that understandings of the public and how they feel has huge effects on policy and governance. And as was pointed out at the start, we know that this is a politicized issue. So what does politicization mean? It means the issue is salient. So many people see it as a very important issue, not as many as they did, not as important as it was 2 or 3 years ago, but still quite important. But also, and this is crucial, there is significant polarization. So there is, and we can see that in the political debate, the issue is politicized, so it's important and also polarized. What we found was there was also significant misunderstanding. And what I'm going to tell you, this is just my little insight into this, but we were invited to give a talk in the European Commission, not to Laurent's DG, which where they're super well informed. This is to another part of the Commission, and they presented the usual kind of scoping note, briefing note for the meeting, and in that note it said that people in Europe are turning against migration. Attitudes are becoming more hostile. This is driven by media coverage, and this is fueling support for the radical or populist right. Now, according to our understanding, that's fundamentally mistaken. Europeans are not becoming more hostile to migration. Attitudes are relatively stable, and if anything, in most European countries, becoming more positive. Media coverage, we would argue, is much more conjunctural, an immediate factor. People's attitudes to migration are much more influenced by early life experiences, socialization, that kind of thing. And also, support for the extreme right or radical right is much more an activation of latent dispositions rather than mass transformation of European citizens into supporters for those parties. So there was a misunderstanding, and we tried to correct it. So that could be the end of the story. We turn up, we have a fascinating PowerPoint presentation. Everybody nods and says, oh, well, we're now convinced, we leave, and that's it, it's resolved. But of course, it's not like that. Data and expertise are not enough. One of the things that we encounter is that worlds collide. Academics and research, or academic research, in my experience, isn't widely used by policy makers and decision makers. There's skepticism about academic research, and not just in the mode of presentation, but also because perhaps an understanding of it as being biased in some ways, which was a point made in the previous panel that I attended, whether right or wrong. When people look at information, they look, who wrote this? Where are they from? And that can affect the way that people absorb information. So this is quite superficial based on my experiences. You'll have your own, of course, but I do think that there is a major issue here, which can be high levels of mutual skepticism in this kind of relationship between research and governance actors, as we might call them. But if in my experience, and Laurent touched upon this, and he put it quite well, hammering the simple message. Because in our research, we have a simple message about attitudes to migration, but it's also, there's something in it which is also quite uncomfortable. So the simple message is that attitudes to migration are not becoming more negative. It's just simply not true. Very high quality longitudinal data demonstrates this. European Social Survey, Eurobarometer, it's clear. But if you want to hammer the simple message, it's not enough to have an elegant PowerPoint. What is important is interaction, persuasion, argument, the social context in which all of us develop ideas, share ideas, persuade others, and are ourselves persuaded, because through these processes we also begin to understand perhaps something different about decision making that we don't understand when we do research. So, you cannot go into a meeting and say, well, I am the expert, look at my PowerPoint presentation. That will alienate. And it's not a very effective strategy to tell people, well, you're wrong. That doesn't tend to be the way to kind of make friends and influence people. So hammering the simple message, I think, requires kind of social interaction. And I think there are initiatives like this, and the event happened in Brussels last week with DG Research, which are very important for that. But they can also be uncomfortable for us, because what our research also shows is not that attitudes to migration are becoming more favourable, but also there are quite uncomfortable trade-offs. So, for instance, we can show through the research that we've done that European citizens support the right for people to seek asylum. And for us at EUI, and maybe for many people here, we would say, well, that's an important finding. But what we also found was that European citizens also didn't see that necessarily as an unlimited right, which raised an issue that people seem to think there should be limits or quotas. That's quite a challenge. They also thought that maybe should be limits on family rights and right to work. That's also a challenge. So actually within our research were kind of normative and empirical challenges, which I think need to become part of this process of interaction. So that's really the point I wanted to make about these ongoing processes of research and governance, and how we as researchers can become part of them. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we had some elements bringing as to the complexity of this process, that is an ongoing process, because if we want to challenge the cognitive bias that every one of us has, it's an ongoing process that we should all be engaged in. So you are also helping us in see how this simple message could be dangerous to some extent. Yeah. So thank you. It's not that easy what we're trying to do, and I now would give the floor to Sarah Spencer. Sarah is a senior fellow at COMPAS, the Center on Migration Policies and Society at the University of Oxford, where she was director on its knowledge exchange arm, the Global Exchange on Migration and Diversity, until last year. Her research focuses on integration and on irregular migrants, on which she has co-edited a book with Anna Triandafilido, coming out on a IMISCO book series in March. Sarah, please, you have led a major research project on the role played by cities in addressing the realities faced by undocumented migrants at the local level, which has involved a multi-stakeholder approach. What lessons have been learned through this model that can be useful for policy agendas?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Universities in the UK have come under increasing pressure to make sure that they have some social and economic impact from the research that we do. Now, not to policy-driven research, but that when we do research, we go the next step to see if we can have impact from it. And that led us to set up this knowledge exchange arm at COMPAS, if you like, the Global Exchange, to see if we could develop new models of engaging with policymakers to deepen the impact that we have. And one of the ways in which we've done that was to take forward the research on cities and on irregular migrants in cities in particular, and organise a working group of cities from 10 European countries that have met together over the past 2 years to exchange expertise. And I think what's perhaps interesting about it is it's a three-way model of exchange. So on the one hand, we give our research and analysis, and they hopefully learn from that. But they very much also learn from each other by us providing the space for them to engage. And then we, in turn, learn back from them, and it feeds back into our research agenda. And I think that points to Andrew's point about it's the social context in which we try to exchange the knowledge that actually deepens the impact that it has. And it seems it's a very different model from that old academic model of dissemination, where we stand on a platform and hope somebody's listening and that they will pick up the policy relevance of it, although, to be honest, we do some of that as well. But we've worked with these cities over the last couple of years. They've produced guidance for other cities on how to respond to irregular migrants, and a mini documentary that hopefully reaches a different kind of audience. And you asked me, what have we learnt from that? I think I'd perhaps pull out three of the things that we've learned from it. One is that there's a real appetite in cities for engaging with researchers because of the challenges that they face. And cities, unlike the Commission, unlike national governments, simply don't have the resources to allocate staff to scour through the research literature to find out what would be relevant for the initiative they're planning or the problem they're trying to solve. They don't actually, on the whole, have resources to go and meet each other, to learn from each other. And when they get together, they do seem to find it very energizing and motivating if it is addressing an issue that they're looking for answers to. So if you like, there is a big market for academics out there for knowledge exchange with cities, as well as with other participants who want to know what we can share with them. And I think the second lesson is that actually we can bring about some change, both in how policymakers think and in what they actually do. So in relation to actually what they do, I can think of concrete examples where policies and practices have changed, either because of the ideas that they've picked up during the times when they've come together and the site visits that we do together, but also actually because of some of the requirements that we put into the process. If you as a city want to be part of this process and have the benefit of our resources of coming together and so on, then there are certain things we require you to do. And one of them has been that they engage civil society in the process. So some of them have set up actual working groups with civil society in the city so that they can engage. So we have a bit of leverage there that we can use. But mostly, of course, it's from what they learn from the process. Secondly, there's a sort of more intangible change in the way that cities think, and they'd actually say this back to us. It's not just the information or analysis that you give us, but you actually make us look at the issue differently. And one example was a city which says, I email NGOs in the city. You call that engaging civil society. And when you call it engaging civil society, that makes me think, why am I doing this? How am I doing this? Could I be doing this differently? It's just a different way of looking at it, and it's just a little example, but it's something about the social science perspective that means that it's not only that we're giving them the time to step back and think about what they're doing, but actually encouraging them, I suppose, to think about it in a different way. And the third way in which I think it's changed the cities is in relation to confidence. There's something about coming together with other cities to talk about an issue, particularly an issue like irregular migrants, which is a difficult, sensitive issue, and the solidarity that gives, that they're doing it together, the way in which they feel stronger because they're armed with the facts, although that's something we can discuss, but they can cite the experiences of other cities, and they sort of feel armed with the arguments that they can use both back within the city about, in this case, why should we provide services to irregular migrants, but also use externally with anybody in the public or with national and EU governments with whom they want to engage. And thirdly, I think what we've picked up, which in a way perhaps we hadn't quite anticipated, is that the role for us as researchers is, or can be, a wider one than being the providers of the evidence and the analysis. First of all, we can actually organise and facilitate this exchange. There's actually a role in bringing people together, in chairing it, in facilitating it, and in helping the cities work towards solutions. But they've also said to us that doing this kind of discussion under the auspices of a university adds a sort of neutrality. It's a safe space in which to talk about issues. It's a bit different from just coming together as cities. It depoliticizes it, and that's been helpful in feeling comfortable about talking about it, and in getting sometimes just agreement within the city to do the journey, to spend the time in the meeting, to have the conversation. On the other hand, they've said to us, it isn't welcome to do it under the auspices of a university if actually the only thing you're interested is in taking what you can get. If the only reason you want to talk to us is so that you can get evidence from us or access to research subjects, then we're tired of fulfilling that role. We need you to want to come together with us because you actually want to help us deliver what we need, and at the same time get us to reflect on it, to think about it in a different way. They want us to be sensitive to the constraints they face as officials or politicians. So there is a whole element about how you can build up the trust in order to have that conversation and the sort of mutual respect to make the relationship work. But I think I learned, as many colleagues obviously have here, because many of us do this, but we can do this. We don't need to leave it to consultants and think tanks to do it. As academics, we can do this with our own research evidence. We can facilitate these conversations and we can make it work. But, and this was a theme that came up in one of the workshops yesterday, we're not actually trained to do it. We're trained to be researchers. We don't, as part of our academic training, learn a lot of communication skills or how to facilitate effective knowledge exchange. And if we want to do it and want to do it well, we now, between us, all have a lot of experience of doing it, but perhaps we should be building it into the regular training for doctoral students, for early career students, indeed for all of us, so that we regularly learn not only how to be good researchers, but how to be good communicators and good conductors of knowledge exchange, so that we can make sure that if we want to, we can enhance the impact of our research through doing this kind of thing, and then maybe reduce the frustration we feel when we do all this research and nobody seems to be aware of it.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for giving us the city perspective, and also for touching upon the role that scientists can have in facilitating conversation, because this is something that it is like to be done in a perspective of service to the others. And as we take a lot from the society, studying society, I think this could be a very nice way to give back in a sense of gratitude. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning this so clearly. And now, before giving the floor to Silvia, who is the policy director at Eurocities, so the cities are here, we have the chance to have Michele Levoy on with an internet connection. Unfortunately, Michele is sick, but she is so nice that she is available to have her speech now. So Michele is the director of PICUM, the platform for international cooperation on undocumented migrants. She serves on several boards and advisory committees, including Social Platform, Global Coalition of Migration, Civil Society Days of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and the Women in Migration Network. She holds a bachelor's degree in Justice and Peace Studies and a master in Applied Science. So I have to talk now in this mic to make...
Hello, Guia. Can you hear me?
So, thank you for being here today. Michele can't hear the audience, but only when we speak in mics. So, Michele, please. One of the areas that ReSOMA has focused on has been criminalization of solidarity. How has the collaboration between civil society stakeholders and academics in this area contribute to the policy agenda?
Yes, thank you very much, Guia. Thank you also for your flexibility in accommodating my request to be able to speak remotely. I would also add that now that Europe is looking at a new Green Deal, I'm trying to test it by doing this remotely. So I wanted to speak a little bit about this one particular thematic area within ReSOMA. And to give this example of criminalization of solidarity, because as you had mentioned, Guia, earlier, actually, thankfully, with this technology, I was actually able to hear the panel. I don't know how it would be for listening to the audience, but at least I could hear the other speakers. You had mentioned in the beginning, Guia, that ReSOMA had looked at 9 thematic areas per year, so kind of 18 in total. So what we had done as a consortium at the start of the project, and also in the start of year 2, was to think, where are some of the key policy areas that we as a consortium are working on from a research, from a think tank perspective, from a civil society perspective, and where are the policy agendas being framed at the Commission level, and how can we kind of find a convergence and focus on thematic areas that would be hopefully useful and that could contribute to the policy debate. So within that perspective, we, within the area of migration, we did narrow down this specific issue of criminalization of solidarity to migrants as one of the issues, for a couple of reasons. I would say that Laurent earlier had actually made a point about irregular migration and the need to, in a sense, prevent it being a big policy area from the Commission. And so we know that this is an ongoing focus from the Commission. So that was, I think, quite evident, and you can see this in all of the work on the anti-smuggling approach over the years. But we had also seen from civil society that there were increasingly a number of cases of people who were being criminalized. So this is why we actually focused on this as one of the key areas. And our main entry point was looking kind of from a research perspective at the facilitators package from 2002. This is actually a very interesting piece of legislation because it came just 3 years after the EU started its common asylum and migration policy. So the text is not even 2 pages long. It's literally a page and a half. And I would say the key challenge with the text is, in a sense, the fact that it is not extremely specific. So it leaves open a number of issues that are still somewhat, not vague, but they're not as clearly defined as they could be. And in transposing this legislative piece from the UN smuggling protocol, which is where it in a sense comes from, it wasn't transposed in the way that the UN had also delineated it. So some of this has actually caused this legal uncertainty. So for example, the UN smuggling protocol says that the crime or intentionally assisting someone to enter or transit across the territory of a member state should be linked with financial and material benefit. But this isn't necessarily specified like this in the directive. And the EU does not foresee any mandatory exemption for humanitarian actors. So the directive says that a member state may decide not to impose sanctions, but this may clause has been the one that has been somewhat problematic because they may or they may not decide. So what we did then as ReSOMA is to look at this particular legislative piece and the situation on the ground in different ways. And I just wanted to briefly highlight 3 key areas where I thought the ReSOMA input to this particular area was actually very useful. So I think the one is ReSOMA allowed for looking at a case analysis and doing research on individual cases of people who had been criminalized. I think it's also interesting to also bear in mind where research starts off, like what basis does it draw on to make its conclusions? Does it really start researching an issue where there has been no previous evidence, or does it build on that? Does it take it forward? So my own organization, PICUM, had actually looked at the issue of criminalization of solidarity already from 2003. We had a project called the Book of Solidarity, where we looked at 10 EU member states and how they were actually dealing with the transposition of the facilitators directive. And so we had done a very, not at all in depth, but kind of a sort of initial mapping at that time of what the situation was. And so this issue has always been a key focus for PICUM. And while we haven't had it as in depth, we've continuously had it as an issue. And so when the major arrivals started in 2015, 2016, we also, because we had continuously been looking at people who were criminalized, we also started to informally do media monitoring. So trying to put together on our website, also with Migration Policy Group, a monitoring of cases of people who were being criminalized. And so when ReSOMA started a couple of years later, it built on already the focus of some of our organizations. There are also many EU networks in Brussels that look at this issue and that have, like PICUM, been following it over many years. ReSOMA built on this already knowledge that had been collected already, as well as the fact that there were a number of cases. So ReSOMA's case analysis then built on that and expanded that. And I think what has been interesting is to also see some of these numbers through this monitoring. So the research that was collected was produced in a policy brief in July last year. And in December, we had a meeting. And so the figures that I wanted to highlight now are actually the ones that were collected until December, but they're also very similar to the findings from July last year. So as of December 2019, the research from ReSOMA has shown that between 2015 and 2019, there were 171 individuals who had been either investigated, arrested, or formally prosecuted on the grounds of smuggling. This involved 60 cases of investigation or prosecution, 44 of which were for entry or transit, 10 for residence or stay, or 6 for multiple grounds. So we basically had, by December of last year, 22 cases that were ongoing, some which had started last year, some which had been continuing for a number of years, involving 95 individuals and volunteers in 8 countries. So ReSOMA was crucial to show these cases, and actually by focusing on the cases and also through a couple of pieces, so this ReSOMA policy brief from July last year that I referred to, a joint statement that ReSOMA also supported. ReSOMA actually got quite a lot of media coverage. So there were this coincided with the fact that, as I just gave with the numbers, there were many cases, many high-profile ones of boats that were being not able to port, to dock at EU member states, and individual firefighters who were criminalized for pulling people out of the water. So it was a combination of kind of a lot of these high-profile cases, as well as the ReSOMA results and the actual context that resulted in a lot of this news coverage. But the coverage included pieces in the EU Observer, Open Democracy, The New Humanitarian, Politico, Time, CNN, as well as coverage in major news or TV media in 7 EU member states, as well as in Brazil. So the second area that I think was also crucial, in addition to this case analysis and the research itself, was it draws a little bit on what Sarah had just been talking about, kind of this facilitation aspect. So the second area was the fact that ReSOMA was doing this research, and part of it was actually facilitating contact between not only the partners who were working on this, so civil society organizations, advocates, and other EU networks, researchers, think tanks, as well as lawyers of people who were criminalized and people who were criminalized themselves. And there were several meetings on strategic litigation. So this was actually one of the thematic focuses of the criminalization of migration work. What could strategic litigation bring to that issue? Several meetings that actually brought together the key lawyers actually in Europe working on these cases, as well as key people within the migration field who are working from a strategic litigation perspective and who could give analysis and exchange on strategies towards the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice, especially in relation to the fact that the Facilitation Directive is an EU instrument. The most recent meeting, well, actually one of the most recent meetings that we had was in December of last year, where we had, so the meeting with the lawyers, and then was followed in the evening by a film screening that was also under ReSOMA. And this was a film called Humanity on Trial, and it showed the case of Salam Aldain, who is a volunteer and who was rescuing people in Lesbos, Greece, a couple of years ago, and who was arrested for saving people from the water, for rescuing people when they were drowning. He and his fellow firefighters and volunteers, so there were 5, including him total, were acquitted in the summer of 2018. But last December, actually a week before we were doing this film screening in Brussels, he was arrested again and given the charge of persona non grata. And so it looked like it was really continuous harassment. And through the fact of bringing together many of these lawyers the same day, including Salam's own lawyer and advocates, there was actually a lot that was done over the Christmas period to file a petition for urgent measures at the European Court of Human Rights. In the end, he actually was released shortly after Christmas. And his lawyer had also indicated that he did feel that this combination of pressure was actually quite instrumental in securing Salam's release. So it's another example of also how this kind of movement and networking had actually been quite effective. And the third area that I wanted to also mention, and how ReSOMA has also been instrumental in this particular issue, is at the advocacy at the EU level. This particular kind of movement of the advocates, the researchers, people affected, it has contributed to 2 independent studies by the European Parliament on this, as well as a resolution from 2018 from the European Parliament, which urged the Commission to adopt guidelines on the facilitation directive. In 2017, the Commission had carried out the refit evaluation and had concluded that the facilitators package should be maintained in its present form. But part of the facilitation role that ReSOMA had was to have a couple of meetings with the Commission during the course of ReSOMA, where we were continuously presenting the findings from the research, dialoguing with the Commission on this, and so also questioning the conclusions of the 2017 evaluation, because it seemed quite out of line with the evidence on the ground, which, if you look at these numbers more in depth, showed that from 2015 until 2019, when ReSOMA actually stopped, in a sense, collecting the data, the cases only were continuing to grow. So it wasn't like the cases were actually decreasing, but there was just a continuous increase in cases of criminalization. So I think what we're looking at now is how the new migration pact will be outlined, and also if there will be guidelines coming out and linked to that on this. And this is something that I think the network within ReSOMA has really helped to spur and to support, and that is something that we're working on now. So I would just conclude by saying that I think in terms of the issues that ReSOMA has looked at, this has been one which has had a very interesting, very multifaceted approach that's involved different ways of working, this facilitation, the monitoring, the media coverage, but especially also the people who have been criminalized themselves. They have been part of this discussion, and that has been extremely fruitful for all of us also as advocates to hear their point of view. And we do hope that we've learned a lot actually from this process. So I just wanted to conclude with this, and I'd be also happy to give any further comments or questions in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele, for having brought to us the concrete aspects of ReSOMA, giving this example. So also the audience can have a clear idea of how we grounded all this process that we have built with this project. And now we will end with Silvia Ganzerla. Silvia Ganzerla currently works as a policy director at Eurocities, the network of major European cities, and she is responsible for economic development and social policies, including migration and refugees agenda. Silvia has also an expertise in policy learning and policy transfer methodologies at city level, and she leads a mutual learning program for social inclusion in cities, also targeting the integration of migrants and refugees. So Silvia, being Eurocities an intermediary stakeholder aiming at facilitating the cooperation between researchers and policymakers, supporting an evidence-based approach, what is the added value of projects such as ReSOMA in your activities?
Thank you, Guia. I know that we don't have a lot of time, so give me a sign if I just run over, because it would be good to have some maybe discussion afterwards. So Eurocities is the European network of major cities in Europe. And we have a role of bringing the voice of cities within the European institutions. It is a very exciting time to be part of Eurocities because it seems that the role of cities in several policy is popping up everywhere, and migration and the refugees is one of the sectors where cities have played a leadership role recently. And I'm very happy that academia researchers are picking up on these points. This is because typically in Eurocities, what we do is to work with the local level, with the city, with the policymakers and practitioners. But what we can do is to facilitate knowledge sharing and mutual learning. So the chance of being part of in a project like ReSOMA has been unique because we were in a position of basically assessing the knowledge gap that we have at the moment and to tell to the exceptionally good researcher to put together some background paper, some research paper that has helped us in our advocacy work, and to substantiate our points as well as to bring evidence in a very coherent way. The two papers that have been very helpful for us have been the one on the role of cities in integration and the one on picking up about the EU fund challenges at local level. These are two topics that we have raised for many years with European institutions, but also with member states. And it was really good to have two background paper that put together all the information that you need to provide to people that take decisions to clearly indicate that city has a role in the integration process. And it makes sense from a policy point of view to unlock the potential, either by reshaping the governance between city, regions, national governments, either by channeling European and national funds directly to city. So, in this respect, ReSOMA has been excellent in supporting our advocacy work and in bringing the evidence to European and national level of what you need to change to make things work in a better way when we talk about integration of migrants and refugees. Clearly, there's more than that, and ReSOMA had a remit, but I think it's very good that this is a project where the end is the beginning of something else. And the fact that we can still be part of this community, and a large community, because the integration in IMISCO, I think, is great. It would really help us to come up with suggestions for researcher, if you want, to focus on. As it has been said by Sarah before, there's a hunger at local level for more information, more knowledge. There's a lot of pressure on policymakers nowadays to demonstrate that policy is based on evidence that things are working. So we need to know what is working and either what is not working. We need to know why something is working or is not working. It would be great to have access to a sort of options. You know that you always have to make choices that are trade-off. So it would be very good to have a sort of like options of what you can do at local level, what are the trade-offs, what are the implications, what you need to put in place. And then we have, this is something that we do in Eurocities, we have a lot of recommendations that we put for Commission, for cities, for national governments, but still it would be good to have a bit of a validation and to see if the recommendation that we are coming up are the real recommendation that we need to work on all together in this new governance process. I think that when we think about the dialogue between policymakers, civil society, and research, we need to keep in mind that is a flexible relationship, and there are many factors that we need to consider. There are different policymakers. It's one thing to speak to politicians. It's another to speak to people with a technical expertise. If I have to provide some evidence to some of our mayors, I have to present and to speak in a way that is totally different from me meeting Laurent and explain all the technicalities. So this is something that is important to keep in mind. And again, it's not maybe the job of academia to speak to politicians, but we have a role as a sort of intermediary between research, between civil society and mayors at local level, to translate the findings into political speaking. There are also different type of knowledge, because when I say that there are knowledge gaps, the gaps can be in different type of knowledge. There's an element of monitoring the trends. There's an element of evidence. There's an element of validation. But also what academia has been doing in a very good way is building theories, is being provocative, is challenging the status quo. I think that on these type of things, the cooperation should also be picked up. Clearly, you need to have a specific format to have this type of conversation, but I think that we still, I believe that research can support policymakers, but research should also be provocative and should really pick up the issues that need to be questioned. Otherwise, you limit a bit the role that academia should have. I think that probably as a way to describe this dialogue would be co-creation, because we are both part of the same process and we do have a way to influence each other and to mutually benefit each other. I think that there are also different roles that we have to play. So if it's for academia to be provocative, my role as Eurocities would be to follow up on the dissemination of evidence, of findings, to make sure that the findings can be listened in the right place. So there's no role to play around influence. And then there's the impact. The evidence we are collecting, the findings that we're having, do they have an impact at policy level? It's not guaranteed, but still it's a bit our role as an association that sits in Brussels with a mandate to advocate, to try to push. We want to see policy changes, local level, national level, European level. That's the level of ambition. Media has been mentioned, and I do believe that we need to engage with media because they have a very important role in shaping the public opinion. And in the end, the media is not policymakers, but they have a huge amount of influence on politicians and policymakers. So having in mind engaging some journalists, for example, trying to think about presenting the findings in a journalistic speaking might help to link some of these gaps that we have at the moment. And I'd like to conclude with maybe providing a very concrete example of something that we could all work together. There's a lot in the research world that says that integration is a two-way process. You need to work with the newcomers, but also with the welcoming, hosting community. Seems excellent. It would be great to know more about that. How does this work? What you have to do to create this sense of community? It seems that it's a bit of a way out to create this, community where people share experience, where people feel part of the same society. as someone that has also in the process of advising politicians at local level, it would be great to say you should do A, B, C, D to create a cohesive community where you work on the two sides, the newcomers and the host community. It would be great to link up the EU funding process, because if we know that this is working and this might produce results, then why not to have EU funds that are to pilot this two-way process of building community? No, it was already in the common basic principle. Integration is a two-way process. Let's continue on that. Let's make it very, very real. And then we can test, we can pilot, we can look at innovative elements. Then academia comes back in doing some evaluation, and then eventually it would be mainstream. And it would be something that is done at national, regional, local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. You recalled us to the provocative role of researchers, but you've been provocative now, and so thank you. So now we have 15 minutes, less or more, to have your question. And given the high standard audience that we have here, I'm sure there will be a question for many different contexts that have been showed today. So who would like to start with questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabella Grabowska. Thank you for great panel, lots of food for thoughts. And again, congratulations to CrossMigration and ReSOMA to do such an incredible job to put all the expertise and knowledge together. I would like to just refer to two things which were brought by the panel, especially by Andrew, saying that we shouldn't focus only on bringing evidence to policy. It's crucial, of course, and for the panel and for both platforms, but above all, research networks are about knowledge creation and about fundamental research. Why I'm saying that? Because without this knowledge creation, independent also from policy, we can make ad hoc rapid reaction studies, which we are suddenly requested from the Commission or other stakeholders, cities, whoever. Yes, so it's very important to be in the both camps, so to say. In one, to create fundamental research, to be ready to use for ad hoc policy studies. Because without this independent knowledge, not reactive, but gathered in the longitudinal, systematic way, we can dig into it, we can take from it wherever there are needs, and to present independent thinking. And just what Silvia said about workings and not workings of the policy solutions. Yes, it's in ideal world, it would be perfect, but we know that some workings are context sensitive. So one things are working in one context and they wouldn't work in the other context. And I'm also the advocate for also promoting not only good practices, but also bad practices. Because while studying failure practices, we learn much more what didn't work in fact and how we can improve these solutions, not only to transplant between the context, the solution. So with these comments, I would like to also raise one question about what Andrew said about hammering simple messages. Yeah, both of you actually said that, and I like this idea, but how to make it in such a complex knowledge landscape that we have many gaps which we discussed yesterday, where we need to find our consensus, where we have consensus between research findings, and when we have uncertainties about our research findings. You remember, Andrew, we were at various tables discussing that, and this is not that easy to hammer this simple message and to send it through. So thank you again for this great discussion, and again, congratulations to ReSOMA and CrossMigration. Thank you very much.
Andrew, Sarah, Laurent, or Silvia, who wants to answer?
Well, I could start, if you like. I think that Isabella's point on hammering a simple message about in some of the work we've been doing recently, that while looking at research on decision making, there's some great work on political decision making by an author called Tetlock. It's not about migration at all, but he makes a distinction between hedgehogs and foxes. Hedgehogs have one big idea, foxes are much more eclectic, gather the evidence, but much more difficult to communicate, and it's often a hedgehog with their big, powerful idea who has more impact than the fox with all their nuance. So one of the things with hammering a simple message is often academic research isn't very easily absorbed into simple messages. Academics are more on the one hand, on the other hand, by which point the decision maker has lost interest. So it's a complex issue, but I mean, I suppose it is trying to condense. I think there are ways where you can, perhaps as Sarah said, through training in communication, understand how to communicate, and to perhaps to understand how people involved in decision making are able to use the knowledge that research can provide. But yeah, I suppose we have to be. We tend to be foxes, but it tends to be the hedgehogs with their big, simple ideas who get on TV.
Isabel, I'm glad you raised this point, because it's always worth reiterating the importance of the research not being driven by policy questions. I think it was Stephen Castles who wrote that kind of research, policy-driven research, is not only bad social science, but is actually bad policy as well, because it means that you're not asking policymakers to stand outside and question the parameters within which they're thinking. So, returning to my point about training, I would say one of the basics of training is what is the difference between research, which is policy-driven and conducted only within the narrative parameters, and research which is policy-relevant, where it's independently conceived, but we pull out the relevance of it for policy and then engage. And I don't think there's any contradiction between ensuring that the research is not policy-driven and actually then wanting to engage. And even if to get people around the table, policymakers need to feel that it will address the questions that they are interested in. Once they are around the table, there is then every opportunity to draw out the wider implications. And I think you talked about the importance of theory and of conceptual challenges. And once we're around the table, those can be raised. But yeah, I agree with you 100%.
Thank you. I don't want to be misunderstood. Let's say that I'm not arguing for any Horizon 2020 project to be only replying to policy questions. And I think currently we are very far from that in a way. We're so far that we keep on relying more on, let's say, products that come from a lot from think tanks, from the European Migration Network, as you may know, from some collaboration with OECD, and that I feel that it's not so positive that we have such a distance to many of the products under Horizon that can be useful to us. So I'm not saying that everything should be based on our policy questions, but more to say that I think this big distance is quite is not positive in the end, because it means that we rely in the EU institutions, it's true, more and more on also consultancy firms to do some impact assessment, etc., who often, start from scratch, rather than relying on the fact that we have this world of academics who could help us sometimes also, perhaps coming with other policy questions. And on producing bad practices, I very much agree with the idea. Listing them, learning from mistakes from the past. The fact that what's working is context specific, it's obvious, but it should not be an excuse not to try sometimes to produce more analysis of, indeed, comparative analysis of which policy did seems to work or not in various countries, in various contexts. So for sure, sometimes we have to explain a lot also that the employment rate of migrants, maybe the gap may be very high in Sweden. It doesn't mean that Sweden has the worst policy and that it's very much related to the category of migrants they have. Half of them being refugees of their relatives. So as you know, and as also it was important, for instance, in my PACs, for instance, to try to liaise, the outcomes also to the context. But so, and on simple messages, what I meant is that I know that you cannot summarize the complexity of migration, outcomes of the research. I'm not saying that you should summarize it in one few page. I'm just saying sometimes my experience, and I wanted to be a bit more optimistic, is that what I experienced in the last few years is that I realized that because policymakers heard more and more some of the relatively simple messages that were repeated several times by the academics, and these were, for instance, the relation between the level of development or the level of income outside of the EU and migration to the EU, potential migration to the EU. Simple things that you knew for a very long time, but on which decision makers at the EU level had a lot of preconceived ideas. I had the feeling that it went through their head. So this is what I wanted. This is what I wanted to say.
Yes, thank you. Just maybe a comment on studying failures. If I would phrase something like that to one of my politicians at local level, they would just say, no, thank you. But if I put it in the context of we have to learn from what didn't work, and we need to identify the factors that are underpinning not getting the results that you wanted, then is a much encouraging way of having access to a sort of information that I think is really interesting to explore. I have to say that at Eurocities we have this community of practitioners, so we have a working group on migration integration, and there's a lot of trust between the members, and it's also a bit of a closed group. So yes, we managed to explore why something doesn't work. I think there's a lot of material there for understanding exactly what is preventing integration, what we need to change. We just need to phrase it as a sort of learning process. So I think that politicians, they don't like the word failure, but clearly, if you rephrase on, in a way that, let's try to do something innovative. We pilot something, and then we do a sort of assessment, and then we see what worked or didn't work, but it's a totally different story. We have to keep in mind that failing is something that politicians really fear. They would never be like to be put on a paper for having done something that was a total disaster. But I do believe that when I mentioned that we do have different role to play in this dialogue, there should be some space for that. They need to be construct in a way that becomes acceptable and enriching. But definitely, there's so much to learn from different policy and practices, and all these focus on the good practices. I mean, you know, there's so much we have collected at European level that you do wonder, yes, and so what next? Again, in Eurocities, what we try to do is to move from identification of good practice to trying to learn from each other and to see some policy changes. And yes, there's the context is different, but still there are elements that could really be adapted to different contexts.
I just conclude thanking the panelists for their contribution, the audience for having been here with us today, and mostly thanking Imisco, because when we started ReSOMA, none of us supposed that at the end of the project we could have such a promising starting point. So I hope we will be able to do our best even in this new, refreshed phase of a dialogue between academia, NGOs, civil society, and policymakers, of course. So thank you, everyone.